In this segment, we're going to begin a discussion of the Congress. The Congress consists of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. They were the most powerful branch of the government as conceived by the founders. The founders clearly placed the Congress at the head or the top of their system. Today it's sometimes said that the three national branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial, are equal branches. They never thought of them as equal. They thought of the Congress as the most important branch. It was in their mind the most important branch because it wrote the laws. And because of their conception of the rule of law, the person or unit that wrote the laws, the lawgiver, was the most powerful branch of all. The president, in their conception, was just a clerk, an administrator, except in time of war when his role as commander-in-chief was emphasized. The judiciary, they hardly knew what they were doing with the judiciary. The third article only refers to a Supreme Court and any other courts created by, guess what, Congress. So it was Congress that was the most important branch of all. Now, why two branches? Why two houses? Not everybody has to have two houses. The state of Nebraska has a state legislature and they have only one house, the Nebraska Senate. All of the other 49 states have two houses, but there's nothing inevitable about having two houses. It is true that if you look back at the British experience, there was a House of Lords and a House of Commons, and it might have seemed as though two chambers made sense. But initially, they didn't necessarily have a two-chamber solution. A simple one-chamber legislature was all they had. But they had a problem. The problem was the heart of the problem of union in the first place. After the American Revolution, the 13 colonies of Great Britain that had been given their independence were in effect individual states, individual nations in the system of nations, bound together only by a kind of loose coalition that won a war. They did have a national government in the form of the Articles of Confederation, but looking at that Articles of Confederation, it's easy to see how weak it was. Couldn't pass anything by a majority vote, had to have a qualified supermajority in order to get anything done, couldn't get any taxes, couldn't address laws that dealt with individuals, and on. The Articles of Confederation was weak because there were 13 different states, independent states, that were acting. So to create a union, you had to figure out a way to combine those 13 states. And there was disagreement from the start. The 13 states weren't equal in size. Some states, Virginia was the largest, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts were among the bigger ones. Delaware, Rhode Island were among the smaller ones. The smaller states wanted equal representation in the national legislature, just as they had had equal representation in the Articles of Confederation. But that equal representation implied that each state ought to have its own sovereign character. And that in turn meant that if they didn't want to do something, they didn't have to. And that was the problem of the Articles in the first place. So the larger states lobbied for a legislature based on population, arguing that more people in larger states needed to be represented to a greater degree than the smaller states. It called for a compromise. And in the end, a compromise was adopted. Two houses, one in which each state was represented equally, the other in which each state was represented in proportion to the number of people who live there. And that continues today. Today we have 50 states in the system. Each state has 2 U.S. senators. That gives us a total of 100 in the U.S. Senate. The House of Representatives says that every state, no matter how small, can have one representative, so that they're not shut out of the business of the House of Representatives. But after that, the number of representatives a state has rises in terms of the number of population. California, with its huge population, gets the largest number of representatives, and they go down from there. Texas, New York, Illinois, and so on. Now, this system was also a part of the conception of separation of powers and checks and balances. The notion that there were two houses that had to enact a piece of that had to pass legislation in identical form in order to create a law meant that there was a check on the actions of the other house. Once again, the framers of our Constitution were not majoritarian Democrats. They were not spokesmen for democracy. Indeed, democracy was frowned on by most of them. They called it a republic in which the people controlled the government, but controlled it through a mechanism which allowed for majority rule in many cases, but also the protection of minority rights. That's our Congress. Now today, no one would say that the Congress was the most powerful branch. That simply wouldn't be compelling. Today, Congress has given away, through grants of legislative authority, a bunch of their law-writing power to the executive branch. It doesn't really mean the president gets it, and I'll explain that later, but it does mean that Congress, as a unified body, has given away their power to write legislation. And this is my belief, supported by some evidence, but it is that the degree to which our nation has moved away from its commitment to the rule of law is equal to the degree to which Congress has fallen into an unpopular state. Today, some of the polls have shown that the popularity of the Congress, that is the number of people who approve of it as an institution, has fallen to about 8%. 8% of the American people? 8%? That's just about the congressmen, their extended family, and their staff. Nobody else likes them. Now, we keep electing the same incumbents over and over again, and that's another story, but the institution as a whole has suffered as a result. So we're going to try to go through that in this next segment of the course. There'll be at least 2 more of these segments discussing the Congress, but altogether you should get a clear picture of what the Constitution is with regard to the Congress, what the congressional powers are, what Congress does, and then the degree to which Congress has lost its power and authority precisely because they failed to do their fundamental function of writing laws. Both of the houses of the National Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, are similar in many ways. They both use a committee system. So they both have standing committees that deal with all regular pieces of legislation, or normal pieces of legislation. Presumably every bill has gone through a standing committee before it reaches the floor to be voted on. Committees are good. In fact, they're so good and so important that I'm going to spend an entire segment on them alone. The Congress also depends on a seniority system. Both houses of the Congress have a seniority system that says the longer you've been there, the more seniority you'll have, and the more authority you'll have over things like office staff and where your office is located, and some basic characteristics of that. And both use a separate seniority system for their committee membership. So how long you served on a committee, right down to the total number of days you served on a committee, become your seniority rank on that committee. And the more senior you are, the more likely you are to become the chairman if your party becomes the majority party in that house, or the ranking member if your party is the minority party in the House. Now, these common features taken together need to be contrasted with differences that are imposed by the Constitution. What are some of these differences? Well, there's a specific reference in the Constitution to the fact that all revenue measures originate in the House of Representatives. That means that if you have a bill to raise taxes or to impose a tax on a new area, that bill has to start in the House. If it starts in the Senate, it won't be considered by the House, and a bill passed by the Senate alone is worthless. You have to pass both houses. This has often made a difference when it's coupled with the committee system. A proposal to amend a tax law has to start in the House. It will start in the House Taxation Committee, which is called the Ways and Means Committee. And if that bill can be blocked in the Ways and Means Committee, the entire House of Representatives can't vote on it, and the entire Senate can't vote on it, because you can't get around the House Ways and Means Committee by starting a bill off in the Senate. The House got a break on that. They were held to be responsible for the taxation because the taxation, it was felt, was something that ought to be handled by those in proportion to population. If the state had more people, they were paying more taxes, they should have more say in how taxes were being imposed. The Senate, which was initially looked at as something of a council, maybe a bit like the House of Lords, advisory, but not advisory because it, of course, had the full strength of legislation. But the Council of the Senate, it was thought, would be more advisory to the President. And they would also represent the states in another way. Where the members of the House of Representatives were elected directly by the people, the members of the Senate initially were appointed by state legislatures and could be recalled by state legislatures. So the states would continue to control the votes of their senators. Each state would have 2, and those senators would be beholden to the state legislature. Now, of course, you could argue that you could change the senators if you could change the composition of the state legislature. That is, if the Democrats controlled it, and then there was a shift in the state legislature so that the Republicans controlled it, the Republicans could then name a new U.S. senator, more beholden to their opinion. That changed, of course. The direct election of senators began during World War I. So we now have 2 houses that are both elected, but they are elected differently. The members of the House of Representatives are kept on a short leash, presumably, because they are elected to only a 2-year term. They must run, all of the House of Representatives runs once every 2 years, and they are, for that reason, said to be closer to the people. The Senate has a 6-year term, and the 6-year terms are staggered. Only 1/3 of the Senate, plus occasionally 1 or 2 for filling vacancies, 1/3 of the Senate is elected in each election year. It takes a total of 6 years to have a complete turnover in the Senate, and we usually don't get a complete turnover at all. And within each state, the senators are also staggered. No 2 senators from any state are elected to a 6-year term in the same year. If a new state comes into the Union, 1 senator will get a 6-year term, and the other senator will get only a 2 or a 4-year term, thereby starting the process of staggering their terms. They get a 6-year term, a staggered term, and they are now directly elected by the people. Now, there are some other changes of responsibility. The Senate, as an advisory body, has extra privileges or extra responsibilities that the House doesn't have.